clapper bore the great deception of Lazarus, what he really saw on the other side. There are stories in human history that comfort people, and then there are stories that disturb them. The story of Lazarus does both. For centuries, the resurrection of Lazarus has been framed as one of the greatest miracles ever recorded. A man dies, a tomb is sealed, for days pass, and then, impossibly, he walks back into the world of the living. But hidden inside that story is a detail so unsettling that most people never stop to think about it. Lazarus came back, and according to later traditions and interpretations, he never spoke about what he saw. No descriptions of paradise, no triumphant testimony, no vivid revelation of heaven's beauty. Only silence, a silence so profound that it created one of the darkest mysteries in religious history. Because if Lazarus truly crossed the boundary of death, why did he return without comfort? Why do some ancient traditions claim he returned grieving? And why do certain early interpretations portray him as a man permanently changed by whatever he experienced beyond the tomb? Tonight, we investigate one of the most unsettling possibilities in biblical history. Not whether Lazarus returned, but what returning may have cost him. Before we continue, subscribe and join this investigation into ancient narratives, forgotten traditions, and the hidden psychological shadows buried beneath humanity's oldest stories about death. Because sometimes the most terrifying mystery is not dying, it is coming back. The traditional Lazarus narrative appears in the Gospel of John. The structure is familiar. Lazarus falls ill. Jesus delays his arrival. Death occurs. A tomb is sealed. And after 4 days, Jesus calls Lazarus back from the grave. But something strange happens immediately after the miracle. The story moves on, almost abruptly. The narrative gives surprisingly little attention to Lazarus himself. No detailed testimony. No description of the afterlife. No account of what he experienced while dead. This silence becomes increasingly unsettling the more you think about it. Because if anyone in Scripture had the opportunity to describe what lies beyond death, it would be Lazarus. And yet the text offers nothing. Not one description of paradise. Not one revelation about what happens after the soul leaves the body. Nothing. Just silence. To many readers, this absence means little. But to historians, psychologists, and scholars of narrative structure, absence itself can become meaningful. Because sometimes what a text refuses to say becomes more important than what it does say. As later centuries passed, traditions surrounding Lazarus began to evolve. Some claimed he became withdrawn after returning. Others described him as emotionally altered, a man carrying knowledge he could never fully express. And one particularly haunting tradition claimed that Lazarus never smiled again except once, upon seeing someone stealing a clay pot, remarking that clay steals clay. Whether historical or symbolic, the story carries enormous psychological weight because it implies detachment. A man no longer emotionally anchored to ordinary human concerns. A man who had seen something that permanently altered his relationship to life itself. Now, historians caution that many of these traditions emerged long after the original gospel account. They are not direct eyewitness records. But legends do not emerge randomly. They emerge around unresolved emotional tensions inside stories. And the Lazarus narrative contains one enormous unresolved tension. What happens psychologically to someone who returns from death? Modern discussions of near-death experiences often focus on comfort, peace, light, transcendence. But not all reported experiences are comforting. Some describe terror, isolation, void like emptiness, disorientation, or overwhelming existential dread. This introduces a disturbing possibility into the Lazarus narrative. What if silence was not evidence of peace, but evidence of trauma? To understand why this idea carries such power, we must examine how ancient people understood death itself. In many ancient Jewish frameworks, death was not always described as immediate heavenly reward. Early Hebrew concepts of the afterlife often centered around Sheol, a shadowy realm of silence and stillness, not necessarily punishment, but not paradise either, a place beyond ordinary life, dim, silent, detached from earthly experience. This matters enormously, because the later Christian concept of heaven were still developing during the period when the Lazarus story emerged, which means ancient audiences may not have imagined death the same way modern audiences do. The assumption that Lazarus returned from blissful paradise may actually reflect later theological expectations rather than the worldview of the earliest listeners. And if that is true, the silence becomes darker, because silence no longer protects mystery. It conceals uncertainty. Now we arrive at one of the most psychologically unsettling aspects of resurrection narratives: return itself. Modern imagination often assumes returning from death will be joyful. But psychologically, return may be profoundly destabilizing. Imagine crossing the boundary of identity itself. Imagine experiencing complete separation from ordinary human reality, then suddenly being forced back into physical existence, back into limitation, back into grief, back into mortality. Would that feel like salvation or exile? This question changes the emotional structure of the Lazarus story entirely, because resurrection stops looking like triumph and begins looking like interruption, an interruption of whatever came after death. At this point, we must confront another difficult possibility. What if the miracle was experienced differently by different participants? To witnesses, Lazarus returning appears miraculous. But from Lazarus's perspective, what if it was terrifying? Ancient narratives rarely describe the internal emotional state of resurrected figures. But psychologically, the implications are immense. Trauma researchers understand that extreme experiences often produce silence rather than explanation. People struggle to describe experiences beyond ordinary language, especially experiences involving fear, disorientation, or existential rupture. And this may explain why later traditions repeatedly emphasize Lazarus's emotional distance after returning, because silence itself becomes part of the mystery. As the investigation deepens, another layer emerges: the role of delayed resurrection. Remember, Lazarus was dead for 4 days, not moments, not hours, for days. In ancient understanding, this represented complete finality. The body had crossed into decay, which means Lazarus's return was not interpreted as resuscitation. It was interpreted as reversal of completed death. This distinction matters because it intensifies the psychological implications. Lazarus was not near death. He was beyond it, and beyond that threshold lies the unknown. Now we enter a controversial interpretive territory. Some scholars argue that the Lazarus narrative functions primarily as theological symbolism rather than historical biography, a dramatic sign narrative designed to demonstrate authority over death. In this reading, the absence of afterlife description is intentional. The focus is not on what Lazarus saw. The focus is on what the miracle signifies. But even if interpreted symbolically, the emotional questions remain, because symbols work precisely by activating human fears and hopes. And few fears are deeper than death itself, which means the silence surrounding Lazarus becomes emotionally powerful regardless of historical interpretation. Silence invites projection, and projection creates mystery. Another disturbing detail often overlooked is this: Lazarus eventually died again. The story does not end with immortality. It ends with temporary return, which means Lazarus experienced death twice. Pause and consider that psychologically. To cross the boundary once may be terrifying, but to know you must cross it again, after already returning, creates a completely different kind of existential burden. This possibility may explain why later traditions portray Lazarus as detached from ordinary life. Because how do you return fully to normal existence after experiencing death twice? As centuries passed, resurrection stories became increasingly associated with hope, victory over death, triumph, eternal promise. But the Lazarus narrative contains a shadow beneath that hope, because unlike later resurrection traditions emphasizing glorified transformation, Lazarus returns to ordinary mortality, back into aging, back into suffering, back into inevitable death, which means his resurrection is not escape from mortality. It is re-entry into it. And that distinction changes everything. Now we arrive at the philosophical heart of this investigation. Humanity desperately wants death to resolve uncertainty. We want clarity beyond the veil. We want assurance, paradise, meaning, continuation. But Lazarus provides none of that. No testimony, no detailed revelation, no comforting roadmap, only return and silence. This silence may be one of the most psychologically important details in all resurrection literature, because silence preserves ambiguity, and ambiguity sustains mystery. If Lazarus had described paradise in detail, debate might end. Instead, the absence of description leaves humanity confronting the unknown directly. As the investigation continues, another question emerges. Why does modern culture instinctively fill that silence with comforting assumptions? The answer may lie in psychological survival. Human beings naturally create narratives that reduce fear of death. Hope stabilizes societies. Meaning reduces existential terror. But ancient texts are often more ambiguous than later interpretations allow. And ambiguity is uncomfortable, which means later traditions frequently soften or clarify unresolved mysteries. The Lazarus story may be one of those mysteries, a narrative later surrounded by hope because its original silence felt too unsettling to leave unanswered. At this stage, the emotional tone of the story changes. Lazarus no longer appears simply as proof of miraculous power. He becomes a figure trapped between worlds, a man who crossed a boundary humans were never meant to understand fully. And once that interpretation emerges, even ordinary details become darker. Why does the narrative move away from him so quickly? Why is there so little focus on his inner experience? Why does the text preserve miracle but not memory? Because perhaps memory itself was a terrifying part. Ancient cultures often treated encounters with death as transformative in dangerous ways. To approach death was to approach mystery, and mystery carried both sacred and fearful dimensions. In some traditions, returning from death altered social identity permanently. The individual became liminal, existing between categories, neither fully ordinary nor fully separated from the sacred. Lazarus fits that pattern disturbingly well. He returns, but he does not return unchanged, and the silence surrounding him becomes part of that transformation. As we move toward the final section of this investigation, one final possibility emerges. What if the greatest deception surrounding Lazarus is not what happened in the tomb, but how later generations interpreted it? Because modern audiences often assume resurrection equals comfort, but ancient resurrection narratives were not always comforting. They were disruptive, terrifying, world-altering. They shattered assumptions about mortality itself, and shattered assumptions rarely feel emotionally safe. So perhaps the silence of Lazarus is not accidental. Perhaps it is the most honest detail in the entire story, because language may fail at the edge of death, and whatever Lazarus experienced beyond that threshold, whether interpreted spiritually, psychologically, symbolically, or historically, may have been too vast, too alien, or too disturbing to reduce into ordinary speech. And that possibility still haunts the story centuries later, not because we know what Lazarus saw, but because we do not. And in that silence, humanity continues projecting its deepest fears, hopes, and unanswered questions about what waits beyond the final boundary. Because the greatest mystery was never the tomb opening. It was a man who walked out, and never explained why he seemed forever changed afterward. And as that silence expands across centuries of interpretation, another unsettling realization begins to emerge. Perhaps the most frightening part of the Lazarus story is not resurrection itself, but the possibility that returning from death does not provide certainty. It provides fracture, because humanity assumes that crossing the boundary of death should answer questions. Instead, the Lazarus narrative seems to multiply them. The story gives no map of the afterlife, no detailed cosmology, no triumphant declaration of paradise. Only a man who returns carrying an absence where explanation should have been. And psychologically, absence is powerful. Human beings instinctively fill silence with meaning, which is why the silence of Lazarus became fertile ground for centuries of speculation. Some traditions imagined hidden wisdom, others imagined trauma. Others imagined that whatever he experienced simply could not be translated into human language. And perhaps that final possibility is the most disturbing of all, because if the experience beyond death exceeds language itself, then humanity may be fundamentally incapable of understanding the thing it fears most. At this point in the investigation, we must examine another important historical factor. Ancient people feared improper return from death almost as much as death itself. Modern culture often romanticizes resurrection, but ancient cultures treated the boundary between life and death with enormous caution. Crossing that boundary unnaturally was dangerous territory. The dead belonged to another realm, and bringing someone back disrupted cosmic order. This fear appears across civilizations, ghost traditions, necromancy prohibitions, warnings against disturbing the dead, stories of people returning altered, all reflect one recurring idea. Death changes identity, and if identity changes beyond death, then returning may not restore what was lost. It may produce something unfamiliar. This possibility creates another layer beneath the Lazarus story, because the narrative never explicitly says Lazarus returned psychologically whole. Readers assume he did, but the text itself remains strangely silent on his emotional state, and silence leaves room for fear. As we continue deeper, another detail begins to feel increasingly significant. Lazarus is called out of the tomb by name. That detail matters, because names in ancient traditions were often associated with identity itself. To call someone by name was to recognize them, restore them, or reclaim them from separation. But this also introduces a disturbing philosophical question. If identity survives death, what exactly returns? The same consciousness? The same memory? The same self? Modern neuroscience still struggles to define consciousness fully, and ancient people understood even less about the mechanics of identity, which means resurrection narratives operate inside one of humanity's oldest uncertainties. What remains after death? The Lazarus story does not answer this directly. Instead, it stages a question dramatically and then refuses explanation. And perhaps that refusal is intentional, because certainty would reduce mystery. But mystery sustains power. Now we move into a darker interpretive territory, the possibility that Lazarus became evidence not of comfort, but of incomprehension. Think carefully about the emotional structure of the story. A man dies, a community mourns, the body decomposes, then the impossible occurs. And instead of becoming history's greatest teacher about the afterlife, Lazarus becomes silent. This is psychologically strange. Human beings who survive transformative experiences often feel compelled to describe them, especially if the experience removes fear. But silence can indicate something else entirely. It can indicate inability, or terror, or isolation from ordinary understanding. Modern trauma psychology repeatedly observes this pattern. Extreme experiences often resist narration, not because they are meaningless, but because they overwhelm normal cognitive frameworks. Language fractures under experiences that exceed expectation, and death itself may represent the ultimate overwhelming experience. This leads us toward one of the most chilling possibilities in the entire investigation. What if Lazarus returned with knowledge humanity was never meant to possess? Not secret doctrine, not hidden prophecy, but existential awareness too destabilizing to communicate safely. Because throughout history, human civilizations have survived partly through shared illusions about death, narratives of justice, meaning, continuation, purpose. These stories stabilize societies psychologically. But what happens if the reality beyond death does not match those expectations? What happens if the boundary reveals ambiguity instead of certainty, silence instead of answers, or worse, something fundamentally alien to human understanding? This is where the phrase "the great deception" begins to take shape, not necessarily as conspiracy, but as psychological necessity. The possibility that humanity survives by believing simplified stories about death because the alternative is emotionally unbearable. At this stage, we must pause and acknowledge an important caution. There is no historical evidence proving Lazarus experienced terror after death. Much of this interpretation emerges from silence, symbolism, and later tradition rather than direct textual description. But interpretation often grows strongest where texts leave gaps. And the Lazarus narrative contains one enormous gap: the missing testimony. The man who should know the answer says nothing. And when the central witness remains silent, interpretation becomes inevitable. As centuries pass, Christian theology increasingly emphasized heaven, resurrection hope, and eternal reward. But early Jewish understandings of death were more ambiguous. Sheol, in earlier traditions, was not clearly paradise. It was shadow existence, stillness, separation, a diminished continuation rather than triumphant reward. This older worldview may linger beneath the Lazarus narrative like a buried layer beneath later doctrine, because if Lazarus entered not radiant paradise but silent shadow, then returning would not necessarily feel comforting. It might feel disorienting, or incomplete, or horrifying in ways difficult to express. Again, we cannot prove this, but the emotional structure of the story leaves the possibility disturbingly open. Now we arrive at another philosophical problem. Would returning from death actually reduce fear or intensify it? Most people assume certainty about the afterlife would create peace. But certainty can also create dread, especially if what lies beyond is not what culture promised. And even if the afterlife contains wonder, the act of dying itself may still remain terrifying, because the process involves dissolution of self, loss of control, separation from reality as we understand it. Lazarus crossed that threshold, then crossed back, and the human mind may not emerge unchanged from such rupture. As this investigation deepens, another strange detail emerges from the structure of the gospel itself. The resurrection of Lazarus directly accelerates the movement toward Jesus' own death. In narrative terms, Lazarus functions as a turning point, a public sign too dramatic to ignore. And because it is too dramatic, it intensifies opposition. This creates an eerie narrative symmetry. Lazarus returns from death, and that return helps propel another figure toward death. Life and death become intertwined in escalating sequence. And once again, resurrection appears not comforting, but destabilizing. At this point, we must examine another recurring motif in resurrection literature: the inability of witnesses to process what they are seeing. Fear frequently accompanies divine or supernatural encounters in ancient texts. Not peace, not reassurance. Fear, because encountering the unknown destabilizes ordinary categories of reality. The Lazarus event would have shattered every ordinary assumption about mortality for those present, and shattered assumptions produce psychological disorientation, which means the miracle itself may have generated as much terror as hope. Now we enter perhaps the darkest philosophical possibility in the entire investigation. What if resurrection is not humanity's ultimate wish fulfilled, but humanity's deepest existential contradiction exposed? Because death gives life structure. Limits create meaning. Mortality shapes urgency. But resurrection disrupts those boundaries. It destabilizes finality itself. And once finality becomes unstable, reality changes psychologically. The Lazarus story therefore becomes more than miracle narrative. It becomes confrontation with the possibility that death is not what humanity imagined, and neither is life. At this stage, we return again to Lazarus himself, the silent figure at the center of the storm. Not preacher, not theologian, not visionary, just a man who crossed a boundary and returned carrying something unspoken. This image may explain why the story remains emotionally powerful even today. Because Lazarus becomes a projection screen for humanity's deepest anxieties about death. Believers see hope. Skeptics see symbolism. Psychologists see trauma. Philosophers see existential rupture. And all of them are responding to the same silence. As the investigation approaches its final movement, another realization emerges. Perhaps the true power of the Lazarus narrative lies not in what it reveals, but in what it withholds. The missing testimony creates endless interpretive space, and interpretive space allows stories to survive across centuries. Because unresolved mysteries do not die easily. They evolve, they adapt, they continue haunting cultural imagination precisely because they refuse closure. The Lazarus story refuses closure, and that refusal may be intentional, because certainty ends inquiry, but mystery sustains it forever. Now imagine the final scene differently. Not triumphant music, not celebration, but silence. A tomb open to daylight. A man stepping back into the world of the living. Dust still clinging to burial cloth. Eyes adjusting to light. Surrounded by people desperate to understand what he experienced. And instead of explanation, only silence, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps grief, perhaps comprehension too large for language itself. And perhaps that silence is the most honest response possible to death, because maybe the boundary between life and whatever comes after cannot truly be translated into human words, only crossed, and cross alone. This is why the story of Lazarus still unsettles people centuries later, not because it proves what waits beyond death, but because it refuses to explain it. And in that refusal, humanity confronts the possibility that the greatest mystery was never resurrection itself, but what returning from death does to the human soul. Because maybe Lazarus did see something beyond the veil, something vast, something incomprehensible, something that shattered every ordinary assumption about existence. And maybe the reason he never fully explained it was because some truths cannot be spoken without destroying the comforting illusions that keep human beings sane. And if that possibility is true, then the silence of Lazarus may not be emptiness at all. It may be warning. But warnings are rarely understood when they arrive wrapped in silence. Human beings are conditioned to trust words, explanations, testimonies, descriptions. We believe truth becomes safer once it is spoken aloud. Yet throughout history, some of the most powerful experiences are described not through speech, but through the inability to speak. Mystics return from visions unable to explain them. Trauma survivors struggle to translate overwhelming moments into language. Even modern neuroscience acknowledges that certain experiences bypass ordinary verbal processing entirely. And death, if consciousness continues through it all, may represent the ultimate untranslatable experience, which means Lazarus' silence may not be suspicious. It may be inevitable. As we move deeper into this investigation, another unsettling possibility emerges. Perhaps humanity has misunderstood resurrection stories because we interpret them from the perspective of the living. We imagine what we would want resurrection to mean: hope, comfort, victory over death. But what if resurrection feels entirely different from the perspective of the one returning? What if returning means re-entering limitation after briefly escaping it? Imagine for a moment the psychological rupture involved. One instant, consciousness dissolves beyond ordinary perception. Then suddenly, sensation returns. Weight returns. Pain returns. Time returns. Memory returns. The body returns. Breathing, gravity, hunger, fear, mortality. Would that feel miraculous or imprisoning? This question radically transforms the emotional structure of the Lazarus narrative, because now resurrection stops looking like reward and begins looking like forced re-entry into suffering. Ancient literature occasionally hints at this darker interpretation of return. Across cultures, figures who cross the boundary of death rarely come back unchanged. Odysseus descends into the underworld and returns burdened with knowledge. Mesopotamian myths portray the realm of the dead as bleak and shadow-filled. Even later visionary literature often describes overwhelming fear accompanying encounters with ultimate reality. These stories share a recurring pattern. The boundary between life and death is not comforting. It is destabilizing. And those who cross it are altered permanently. Lazarus fits that pattern disturbingly well, because the story preserves a miracle, but omits emotional restoration. We are told he lived again. We are never told he recovered psychologically from whatever he experienced. Now we arrive at another chilling detail often overlooked. The people surrounding Lazarus are focused almost entirely on what his resurrection means for them. Proof, wonder, authority, belief. But no one asks the deeper human question: what did resurrection mean for Lazarus himself? This absence creates emotional imbalance inside the story. The community celebrates, but the resurrected man remains psychologically invisible, and perhaps that invisibility reflects something profoundly uncomfortable, because the miracle serves theological and communal meaning, while Lazarus himself may remain trapped carrying the private burden of the experience. At this point, we must examine another dimension rarely discussed in religious interpretation: survivor psychology. Modern studies of people who survive catastrophic experiences reveal recurring emotional patterns: detachment, difficulty reconnecting with ordinary life, loss of interest in social concerns, existential disorientation, a sense that everyday reality has become strangely fragile or unreal. Now imagine these symptoms amplified by an experience involving death itself. The result could resemble what later traditions project onto Lazarus, a man emotionally distant from ordinary existence, not because he gained heavenly certainty, but because his relationship to reality itself had changed. As this investigation deepens, another question becomes unavoidable. Why does the gospel narrative preserve no direct dialogue from Lazarus after his resurrection? Think about that carefully. A man returned from death, and yet the text contains no extended speech from him explaining the experience. In literary terms, this is extraordinary. The single witness to humanity's greatest mystery is narratively muted. This silence creates tension so powerful that later generations instinctively try to fill it. Legends emerged. Speculations multiplied. Theological assumptions developed. Because humans cannot tolerate unexplained silence around death for long. Silence invites fear, and fear demands narrative. But what if the absence of testimony was intentional? Not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever lay beyond death could not safely be reduced into simple explanation. Ancient religious traditions often conceal dangerous knowledge behind symbolism and silence. Mystery itself becomes protective, and perhaps the Lazarus narrative preserves precisely that kind of protected ambiguity. A boundary humanity is permitted to approach, but not fully cross through language, because full knowledge of death may fundamentally alter how humans live. Now we enter a deeply philosophical territory. Human civilization depends heavily on stable assumptions about meaning. We assume life matters because it is finite. We assume morality matters because existence has structure. We assume suffering can be endured because there is hope beyond it. But what if the reality beyond death destabilizes those assumptions instead of confirming them? What if death reveals not comforting certainty, but incomprehensible vastness, or terrifying ambiguity, or dissolution beyond individuality? These possibilities have haunted philosophy for thousands of years, and the Lazarus narrative touches all of them without answering any directly. That may be why it remains so psychologically powerful, because unresolved existential questions produce stronger emotional reactions than resolved ones. As centuries passed, religious art and theology increasingly softened resurrection imagery, glowing light, triumphant return, peaceful transcendence. But earlier traditions often carried sharper edges. Fear of judgment, fear of shadow realms, fear of cosmic separation, and underneath the polished hope of later interpretation, traces of those earlier anxieties still remain. Lazarus may represent one of those traces, a story where resurrection occurs, but emotional reassurance never fully arrives. At this stage, we must revisit the 4-day delay, not merely as biological detail, but as psychological symbolism. For days represents completion, irreversibility, the crossing of certainty. Lazarus was not almost dead. He belonged fully to the realm of the dead in the minds of witnesses, which means his return violates more than biology. It violates emotional order. Death functions psychologically because it creates closure. Resurrection destroys closure, and destroyed closure creates existential instability. This may explain why resurrection stories generate both hope and fear simultaneously, because they promise victory over death, while also threatening the stability of reality itself. Now imagine Lazarus after the miracle, not as a triumphant hero, but as a man trapped between categories. The living see him as proof, but he himself may no longer feel fully connected to either world. Too alive to belong to the dead, too transformed to feel ordinary among the living. Anthropologists call this liminality, existing between identities, between states, neither fully one thing nor another. Lazarus embodies that state completely. And liminal figures often disturb societies because they blur boundaries humans rely on psychologically. Another disturbing detail emerges when we consider time itself. Most people fear death partly because it represents the unknown future. But Lazarus had already encountered that future once. He no longer feared abstract death. He feared remembered death. And remembered death is psychologically different. because anticipation becomes memory. The unknown becomes known. Whatever Lazarus experienced, he carried the burden of knowing he would eventually face it again. This possibility alone could explain profound emotional transformation after resurrection. As we continue deeper, another question emerges from the structure of the narrative. Why resurrect Lazarus at all? If eternal life awaits beyond death, why pull someone back into mortal suffering? This question creates theological tension that many readers overlook, because resurrection in the Lazarus story is temporary, not ultimate, not permanent transcendence. Temporary return to mortality, and temporary return changes emotional meaning entirely. Instead of escape from death, Lazarus experiences postponement of death. He must eventually die again. The miracle delays the boundary. It does not erase it, and perhaps that delay itself carries hidden tragedy. At this stage, we approach one of the darkest interpretive possibilities. What if Lazarus' resurrection was experienced by observers as blessing, but by Lazarus' loss? Loss of whatever peace, stillness, or release existed beyond death. Loss of transcendence. Loss of separation from suffering. This interpretation radically destabilizes traditional assumptions because it suggests resurrection may not automatically align with the desires of the resurrected person. Again, the text never says this directly, but the emotional ambiguity leaves the possibility disturbingly open. Now we move into another layer of existential analysis. Human beings define reality through continuity. We trust that life flows in one direction: birth, aging, death. But resurrection interrupts continuity, and interrupted continuity destabilizes identity itself, because identity depends partly on narrative coherence. When death occurs, narrative should end, but Lazarus' narrative resumes after conclusion, and resumed narratives create psychological fracture. The ending no longer feels stable, neither for Lazarus nor for those witnessing him. This may explain why resurrection stories remain so emotionally disruptive even today, not because modern people necessarily believe them literally, but because they challenge the deepest structures humans rely upon psychologically: finality, mortality, closure, identity. The Lazarus narrative destabilizes all four simultaneously, and that destabilization creates lasting emotional power. As this investigation approaches its final movements, another realization emerges. Perhaps the true horror of Lazarus is not death itself, but the possibility that death changes perspective so radically that returning to ordinary human existence becomes emotionally unbearable. Imagine carrying awareness others cannot comprehend. Imagine seeing ordinary life after crossing beyond it. Every conversation would feel smaller, every concern more fragile, every fear more temporary, not because life becomes meaningless, but because meaning itself changes scale, and scale changes everything. This may explain why later traditions portray Lazarus with emotional distance, not necessarily sadness alone, but separation. A man who had glimpsed something beyond normal human categories, something that permanently altered his relationship to existence itself. And once again, silence becomes central, because perhaps language cannot survive contact with ultimate reality intact. Perhaps words collapse at the edge of death. Now imagine the final years of Lazarus' life. People constantly staring at him, questioning him, projecting hope onto him, wanting certainty from him, wanting reassurance. And all the while, he carries an experience he cannot fully communicate, an experience everyone wants interpreted through comfort, while he himself may no longer experience reality comfortably at all. That image transforms the story from miracle narrative into existential tragedy. Not merely a man brought back to life, but a man. And if silence can function as warning, then the Lazarus narrative becomes something far more unsettling than a miracle story. It becomes a confrontation with the limits of human understanding, because humanity has always assumed that knowledge is comforting. That answers reduce fear. That revelation heals uncertainty. But history repeatedly shows the opposite can also be true. Some knowledge destabilizes. Some revelations fracture identity. Some truths alter the human mind simply by being understood. And death may represent the ultimate category of destabilizing knowledge. which raises a terrifying possibility. What if Lazarus returned carrying not peace, but awareness? An awareness impossible to integrate fully into ordinary life. At this stage in the investigation, we must examine how human beings psychologically process encounters with the incomprehensible. Modern psychology recognizes that certain experiences overwhelm normal mental frameworks. Extreme trauma, near-death events, profound isolation, existential terror. These experiences can permanently alter perception of reality, not because the person becomes irrational, but because their previous assumptions collapse. And when assumptions collapse, identity itself begins to shift. The Lazarus narrative may reflect exactly this kind of rupture, because resurrection is not merely survival. It is a destruction and restoration of personal continuity, a complete interruption of existence, followed by re-entry into life. No human mind could emerge from such an event untouched. Now consider something even darker. The Lazarus story does not tell us whether he wanted to return. Modern audiences instinctively frame resurrection as desirable, but the text never explicitly says Lazarus desired restoration to mortal life. This omission matters, because desire changes interpretation completely. Imagine existing beyond physical suffering, beyond hunger, beyond fear, beyond time as humans understand it, then suddenly being dragged back into a decaying world of pain, aging, and inevitable death. Would that feel merciful or violent? The question transforms resurrection from gift into possible burden, and burden changes the emotional atmosphere of the story entirely. As we move deeper, another unsettling pattern emerges in ancient resurrection narratives. The returned individual is often strangely distant afterward, not fully reintegrated into ordinary society. Marked, changed, liminal. Anthropologists use the term liminality to describe states between categories, between childhood and adulthood, between outsider and insider, between life and death. Lazarus becomes the ultimate liminal figure, no longer fully belonging to the dead, but never fully ordinary among the living again either. This in-between state creates profound psychological isolation, because people who cross boundaries others cannot understand often become emotionally separated from their communities, not through rejection alone, but through difference of experience itself. At this point, we should examine another dimension often ignored in religious interpretation: the fear of consciousness continuing after death. Most human beings claim to want continuation, but continuation raises terrifying questions. What if awareness persists without body, without time, without familiar sensory reality? Human identity is deeply connected to physical experience, touch, movement, breath, sound. Without these anchors, what remains of consciousness? The Lazarus narrative forces this question into existence without answering it. And perhaps that unanswered question explains why the story remains psychologically disturbing. Because the unknown after death may be frightening, not because it ends awareness, but because awareness continues and forms humans cannot imagine safely. Now we arrive at one of the central paradoxes in all resurrection stories. Humanity longs to defeat death, but defeating death may also destroy the meaning structures built around mortality. Think carefully about this. Mortality creates urgency. Urgency creates value. Value shapes meaning. But if death becomes reversible, then finality dissolves. And when finality dissolves, so do many of the psychological systems humans rely upon to structure existence. This means resurrection is not merely biological reversal. It is philosophical destabilization. The Lazarus narrative, therefore, threatens more than death itself. It threatens humanity's entire understanding of what life means. As centuries passed, later traditions often softened this destabilizing element. Resurrection became associated with hope, reunion, eternal peace. But the earliest layers of the Lazarus story remain emotionally raw. A tomb, decay, a body returning, and silence, the rawness matters. Because unresolved stories carry more emotional intensity than resolved ones, and the Lazarus narrative never fully resolves. It leaves emotional fractures visible beneath theological interpretation. At this point, another possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps Lazarus's silence was not inability. Perhaps it was refusal. refusal to reduce the experience into human categories, refusal to offer simplistic comfort, refusal to pretend the mystery beyond death could be safely explained, because some experiences resist translation not due to trauma alone, but because language itself becomes inadequate. Philosophers have long argued that human language evolved for survival within physical reality, objects, movement, emotion, social interaction. But death may represent a category beyond ordinary cognition entirely, and if so, any attempt to describe it would inevitably distort it. This could explain why many mystical traditions across history emphasize silence when approaching ultimate reality, not because nothing exists, but because words fail. Now we turn toward another deeply unsettling dimension, memory. If Lazarus remembered what occurred beyond death, then memory itself becomes a burden, because memory shapes identity. Traumatic memory, especially. Modern neuroscience shows that extreme experiences alter the brain's perception systems permanently. Fear conditioning changes. Emotional regulation changes. Perception of reality changes. If ordinary trauma can reshape consciousness, what would death itself do? The Lazarus narrative never tells us how he emotionally functioned afterward, but later traditions repeatedly portray emotional distance, seriousness, and detachment. Again, these traditions cannot be confirmed historically, but psychologically they resonate, because people intuitively understand that death changes those who encounter it closely. As the investigation deepens further, another terrifying idea emerges. What if the greatest deception surrounding death is humanity's assumption that understanding it would comfort us? Modern culture frequently portrays revelation as liberating, but history shows revelation can also be devastating. Imagine suddenly understanding your own mortality completely, not abstractly, not philosophically, but experientially. Would that produce peace or existential collapse? The Lazarus narrative may disturb people precisely because it hints at this possibility without resolving it. At this stage, we must examine the relationship between resurrection and identity continuity. Philosophers have debated for centuries what makes a person the same person over time. Memory, consciousness, body, soul. If a person dies completely and later returns, continuity becomes philosophically unstable. Is the returned person identical to the original, or only connected through restored memory and body? Ancient audiences may not have framed the problem in modern philosophical language, but the emotional tension still exists inside the story. Lazarus returns, yet something about return itself feels incomplete, because death interrupts continuity in ways humans struggle to conceptualize. Now we move toward a broader cultural interpretation. Across civilizations, stories about returning from death often carry warning alongside hope. Orpheus descending into the underworld, near-death visions, ghost narratives, resurrection myths. Again and again, crossing the boundary changes individuals permanently and often isolates them from ordinary humanity afterward. This recurring pattern suggests something profound about human psychology. Perhaps humans instinctively sense that confronting death directly would fundamentally alter perception of existence. The Lazarus narrative embodies this fear perfectly, because it stages humanity's oldest impossible wish, and then surrounds it with silence. As we continue, another subtle detail becomes increasingly haunting. The crowd around Lazarus reacts emotionally, but Lazarus himself remains psychologically opaque. This imbalance matters. The witnesses express amazement. The community responds dramatically. But the central figure, the one who actually crossed death, remains unreadable. It is as though the narrative deliberately withholds access to his interior state, and that withholding creates unease, because the most important perspective is the only one denied to the audience. Now, consider this from a literary perspective. Ancient narratives often conceal the most dangerous knowledge indirectly. Mystery protects power. Silence protects ambiguity. And ambiguity allows stories to endure across generations without collapsing into certainty. The Lazarus story may function exactly this way. Its emotional power depends on unresolved absence. The unanswered question sustains the narrative. What did he see? Why did he never explain? Why does the story move away from his experience so quickly? These unanswered questions create permanent interpretive tension, and permanent tension creates enduring mythic power. At this point, another possibility emerges that is perhaps the darkest yet. What if Lazarus realized that humanity fundamentally misunderstands death? Not necessarily that death is horrific, but that it is radically unlike human expectation. Humans naturally anthropomorphize the unknown. We imagine familiar landscapes, familiar emotions, familiar continuity. But what if reality beyond death is so different from human cognition that ordinary concepts collapse completely? The mind might not even possess the tools necessary to process it coherently. And if Lazarus encountered such reality, silence might not merely be emotional, it might be structural impossibility. As this extended investigation approaches its final movement, we return again to the image of Lazarus emerging from the tomb, not triumphant, not preaching revelation, simply returning. And perhaps that simplicity is intentional, because the story does not offer certainty. It offers confrontation. Confrontation with mortality, with ambiguity, with the possibility that death remains fundamentally mysterious even after resurrection itself. This is why the story continues haunting human imagination, because it never fully resolves into comfort. A comforting story would explain the afterlife clearly. A comforting story would reassure. But the Lazarus narrative leaves humanity staring into silence, and silence forces projection. Every generation places its fears into that silence, its hopes, its doctrines, its existential anxieties, and the silence absorbs all of them without answer. Now imagine Lazarus years later, living ordinary days after extraordinary rupture, eating, walking, aging again, knowing with absolute certainty that death waits a second time. That awareness alone would alter every moment of existence. Because most people survive psychologically through uncertainty. We do not know what death is, and that ignorance protects us. But Lazarus may have lost that protection forever. And if he did, then resurrection may have been less liberation than irreversible awakening. This may explain why the story remains emotionally dangerous even today, not because it disproves hope, but because it destabilizes assumptions. It asks questions humanity desperately wants answered, then refuses to answer them. And in that refusal lies its enduring power, because the greatest terror has never been death itself. It is the possibility that even those who return from beyond it cannot explain what waits there. And if Lazarus truly carried knowledge from the other side, then perhaps the most merciful thing he ever did for humanity was remain silent.